I'd like to start with a paradox that's been on my mind a lot lately. This year, more people than ever in human history, around 4 billion of them, will have a chance to cast a vote. In Togo and Brazil, Mexico and Mauritius, South Korea and Turkey, in the United States of America, and of course here, citizens will choose leaders by participating in a crucial practice of democracy. This is a prospect that might make some Democrats giddy, except for the fact that at the very same moment, a global democratic revolution that seemed imminent at the start of the 21st century seems now to have stalled. A historical landmark of the early 2000s was that for the first time, there were more democracies than dictatorships across the world. 20 years later, dictatorships have rallied. According to research from the Carnegie Endowment, there are once again more dictatorships than democracies across the world. Meanwhile, and perhaps more insidiously, admired democracies, including the most powerful, the United States, the most populous, India, and the most elderly, the United Kingdom, began to backpedal, began to do covertly, sometimes defiantly, shockingly undemocratic things, calling into question the very practice of elections and attempting to sabotage electoral results, imprisoning opponents instead of going to the bother of defeating them electorally, removing the transparency of how political parties are funded in order to benefit the ruling party, appointing supporters to watchdog positions, suppressing the investigative media, using the law to silence critics, including research and civil society organizations, and systematically using disinformation and falsehoods to manipulate citizens. All of which is another way of saying that the simple binary between autocracies and democracies is a bit absurd. The world we live in is a tricky one, because it is one in which the contrary potentials of autocratic oppression and democratic liberties coexist in intimate proximity, and where one system can slide quietly into the other. As leaders and parties seek re-election, they often do the groundwork to ensure that they're competing in one-horse races. Sometimes the ploys and plots to derail democratic choices are foiled, as in Pakistan, where the imprisonment of Imran Khan and the harassment of his party members may still not stop them from just pulling off a victory of sorts. More often, the ploys succeed. Just a few days ago, we all learned of the death of Alexei Navalny, a tragedy we might see as a macabre form of corpse messaging, a signal in advance of the Russian elections next month that genuine opposition to Putin will not be tolerated. And still, here and elsewhere, there's a tendency to exaggerate the distance between us, good Democrats, and the regimes of, say, a Putin or a Kim Jong-un. We pretend. We even delude ourselves. The democracy we like to speak of seems stately as a Sunday stroll in the park or a colorful carnival of choice, while the democracy we're actually witnessing is a blood sport. If we don't face the ruthlessness of our systems, we won't challenge it, and it won't be changed. Historically, it's a habit of young democracies to do the opposite of confronting fault lines, danger signs in their own systems. The tendency, rather, is to seek out consoling antecedents, to show that however new to democracy we might seem to be, we're naturals to it, because of our ancient traditions. We are the true inventors, the begetters, the mother of democracy, aren't we? What do we have to learn from Athens or from other Western democracies when our traditions, too, are steeped in democracy and consensus? When democracy is, we tell ourselves, in our blood. Let's put aside the fact that the phrase "in our blood" is nearly always up to no good. I want to focus instead on established historical facts. Across the span of Indian history, there were indeed brief periods when practices of collective decision-making, based on consensus or majority choice did exist. There have also been examples of rulers who did not interfere in the beliefs and cultural ways of their subjects. But this is far from democracy in any meaningful sense, and it does not describe an underlying pattern or direction to India's history. It's more accurate to say that for several millennia, the social orders of our subcontinent have been shaped by principles of hierarchy, religious exclusivity, and conflict. As usual, Ambedkar expressed it well. Democracy in India, he said, is only a top dressing on Indian soil, which is essentially undemocratic. And as I showed in my book, The Idea of India, democracy was established in India against both imperial domination and against even deeper set social structures of caste oppression. The Indian founders had to imagine, argue for, and invent institutions and practices to create a democratic republic, while also borrowing, with discretion and thought, from other systems all over the world. So if the idea that we Indians are naturals at democracy is a fiction, is it a harmless one? I don't think so, especially when the shifting numbers I began with about the resilience of 21st century dictatorships, as what those numbers are signaling. Democracy isn't just ridiculously hard to establish, it's also difficult to keep. Across most of human history, power has been a monopoly trade. To sustain our democracy in India, we need self-awareness of how fragile it is, not self-congratulation at how brilliant we are at it. We need to see it not as the culmination of past glory, but as a work in progress, which requires the critical scrutiny and input of every citizen to build something new. That requires us as citizens to be more vigilant of what democratically elected governments are doing, to what extent they're actually serving the people's agenda, to invoke the title of this summit. Financial inclusion, the expansion of infrastructure, these are undoubtedly needed and positive achievements of recent years. But we also need to investigate so that we can improve why our basic education is so poor, how the quality of air in our cities creates endemic health problems for the most vulnerable, why over 1/3 of India's children are still malnourished. Parents need to be able to hold governments to account, and that requires the freedom of information and discussion. Yet in a climate where criticism is unwelcome and where violence has been normalized, we should be alarmed. For when the threat of violence becomes the background hum of a society, it represents more than just the suppression of human rights. It induces a wholesale draining of a society's mental and intellectual energies. It instills fear across a significant portion of the citizenry. It curtails free conversation, it shuts down the critical imagination, and it shrinks the pool of ideas available to a society. Ideas that are vital to sustaining an innovative and creative entrepreneurial economy. A fearful citizenry also deprives governments of critical feedback loops that are essential to improving policy and addressing urgent needs like inequality. Nor can we be complacent about the laws being made, whether to do with citizenship or control of the digital information order. And we need to worry deeply about the integrity of the Constitution itself, as the great jurist Fali Nariman, whose death yesterday we mourn, continually reminded us. Such fundamental changes will have consequences well beyond the next few electoral cycles and will shape the kind of polity we bequeath to future generations. In closing, it seems to me that the richest and most profound meaning of the idea of India is one that is open to diverse and competing beliefs. A conception of a nation not as an achieved ideal to be retrieved from the past, but a work in progress, a future to be realized through democratic debate. What democracy can offer us is a space where differing imaginations of India encounter one another, seeking to persuade and willing to listen. The prospect of a nation advancing through self-criticism to a more complex understanding of itself and to greater accountability to all its citizens. This idea of India, a genuine commitment to democracy beyond the electoral spectacle, offers dividends from the ethical to the economic in a global market that is increasingly driven by intellectual innovation and creativity, and that depends on the freest possible space for thought and expression. I began with a paradox. Let me end with an irony, one that becomes apparent if we look for a moment at Europe in the present century. The classical European nation-states, as created in the 19th century, define themselves by a set of exclusionary markers drawn from religion, language, or race. That model has steadily unraveled in Europe as decades of migration made European societies more religiously, culturally, and socially diverse. Even Britain's Brexiteers, who promised to severely limit migration, have had to reverse course. And the UK today is more socially diverse than ever, due to immigration that is now even higher than before Brexit, despite the best efforts of your opening speaker tomorrow morning. So too, France, Sweden, Germany, Italy, all had to learn to adjust their nationalist models and live with greater internal diversity, and to value the economic benefits that follow. Meanwhile, we seem to be moving in an opposite direction. From our inception as a democratic republic in the 1940s and 50s, we gave space to diversity and differences, imperfectly, of course, yet still more impressively than elsewhere. Yet today, we seem stubbornly determined to remake ourselves in that obsolete image of the European nation-states. And in doing so, we're dismantling our own distinctive, challenging, and inspiring Indian identity, which itself became a model for other new nations around the world. Some may see this political trend line as leading us to a new sense of nationhood, Bharat. Others may see it as short-sighted self-sabotage. But history, I wager, will see it as a lost opportunity. Thank you.
Wonderful, Sunil. Thanks. Come and join us, and we'll pick up the conversation from where you left it. That was an interesting analysis, and I'm wondering whether it sort of puts you in line with the rating that the prestigious Varieties of Democracy Institute in Sweden has come up with last year when they downgraded India in their international listing of democracies from a democracy to what they called an electoral autocracy. Does that sound like pretty much your analysis of where we're heading? We elect somebody, but they behave autocratically?
Well, I think,
You'll have to hold it a bit closer.
So I think, rankings are always indicative. I think a more qualitative interpretation always helps much more. Rankings just give you the kind of bare outlines of a situation. I think there has been a tendency to overemphasize the importance of the electoral moment in democracy. The winning of power seems to sanction the use of power in all sorts of ultimately unaccountable ways. And I think there's been a tendency to forget that democracy is a complex system of different practices. One aspect of it is how the popular will is represented through elections. But there are also institutions that have to function impartially, like courts, like election commissions and other sorts of institutions. So it's
Parliament itself.
Sorry?
Parliament itself.
Parliament itself, absolutely. And the way the Indian Republic was designed was that sovereignty wasn't all centralized in one single entity. It was dispersed across different institutions which governed together in a system. And I think because elections are so powerful and they are such a kind of, they have such a clear, decisive outcome, they're very good media stories as well. they tend to fill the whole space of how we think about democracy. And so I think in this moment when people across the world are, it's a wonderful moment that there are so many who can cast their vote. But it's important for us to remember that there's much else to keeping democracy going. And we need to think about these other institutions, because otherwise, there is this sliding scale between autocracy and democracy. It's part of a spectrum. They're not two qualitatively different kinds of regimes. And I think the more we're aware of that, the more we can be sensitive to where on that scale we actually are.
Would you agree that we seem to be sliding down a bit? I mean, I remember when Jayaprakash Narayan gave up electoral politics in the mid-1950s. He said it was because he was convinced that Indian democracy was about a bunch of sheep electing their shepherd, which I thought was a rather interesting analogy, the idea being that once the shepherd has been elected, he pushes the sheep around. And that's what he felt was already happening then. So you can imagine now, 70 years later, is that where we are?
Well, Ambedkar gave up on Indian democracy in the early 50s too. I mean, he said, this is not going to work. And JP was another such figure. I think that, part of the functioning of a democracy is always to be self-critical about itself. So I'm not one who says, we've reached a terminal endpoint or anything like that. I think we have to keep the discussion going. We have to keep our engagement in the process going. And it's a constant struggle. Democracy was never won easily anywhere in the world. And nor is it when it's achieved. As I said, it's very hard to keep it. It's a constant, but neither am I comfortable writing it off, neither am I comfortable saying we're arrived and we've done it all and it's fine now. It's an intellectual struggle, it's a practical struggle, and it involves getting engaged in these issues and not sitting back and saying, well, it seems to be all going fine, everyone is going out to vote, that's a good indicator, because that's not enough. That's only the winning of power. But power has to be held accountable. That's what democracy is about.
Quite right. I mean, you ended with the irony that a country like Britain is now far more diverse, as are many of the European nation states, and that in India there seems to be a war on our diversity. One of the things that strikes me about that is that Ambedkar again was prescient. Even before his disillusionment with the workings of democracy, in 1948 he said in Parliament that the majority must never forget the importance of attending to the needs of the minority. And he gave two reasons. First of all, that across the world and across history, minorities have been an explosive force when dissatisfied. And secondly, he said, don't forget that they are here because they trust you. And he said, don't forget you're a communal majority and not a political majority, and you need that much more to take minority interests into account. Is that being done enough in India?
Well, I think that, a couple of things to say about that. First of all, I think that it was not Ambedkar alone. I mean, the question of the position of minorities was widely debated in the Constituent Assembly, and there was, general view that this was the protections and had to be built into the system, because that was what was going to be very distinctive about India. That was what made it different from those parts of India that had broken away. And there was also an understanding that if this very different, diverse country was going to hold together, it had to recognize different kinds of differences. That was sort of, it wasn't a discretionary choice. It was part of the intrinsic architecture. And I think subsequently, and I think perhaps now, it's seen more as a discretionary choice, rather than integral to the really survival and functioning of a system such as ours. And I think, you picked up on the point on Europe. I think what the European nation states are having to do is to learn the hard way, having been once these homogeneous societies, how it feels to become a more diverse one. And in a sense, we have begun with this, this great initial diversity. And that's actually a great advantage. And it seems to me it's a lost opportunity to be throwing away the learning that has come out of that. And it's a learning that's come out of, 200 years of modern Indian thought. I mean, this question of how the diversities of India can hold together goes back to the late 19th century. It's not a recent question. And then, of course, Tagore, Gandhi, I mean, all of the great minds of modern India have struggled with this question. And do we really think today we've come up with qualitatively better answers to that question than some of those minds put forward and some of the ways in which it was arranged in the Constitution put forward? That's a question for us to think about.
Absolutely. Now, Sunil, you're very well known in this country for your first book, The Idea of India, back in 1997. That was a phrase that I believe Tagore came up with, and then Amartya Sen used it as the title of a famous lecture in Oxford in the early 90s, but you made the phrase famous by putting it on the cover of your book. Tell us about what has changed about the idea of India, or the many ideas of India, from 1997, when you published that book, to today.
Well, first of all, I mean, when I wrote the book, I had no idea that the phrase would be taken up as it was. And you know, to the point where the Prime Minister used it 19 times in a parliamentary speech, which is not something I could have imagined. What I would say is that when I wrote the book, the first edition of the book, it's gone through several editions in which I've tried to sort of address changes and shifts. But when I wrote the first edition, it was written at a time of crisis, at a time of global crisis, the end of the Cold War, and at a time when we had just begun liberalization, when the one-party dominant system was coming to an end in India, and when religion was entering into public life. So it was not written at a settled moment. And I think that the broad trend lines that I analyzed in the book, still remain in play. That politics is still defining us. Politics has redefined caste. Today it's redefining religion. And of course there have been battles and shifts and arguments about what the definition of the nation is. But what I was trying to say in the book was that's exactly what the idea of India is. It allows space for differing arguments and definitions of what the Indian nation is. But when it becomes problematic is if one definition claims a monopoly or privilege over all others. Because what struck me as extraordinary about the founding idea, and again, the founding idea was not just invented in 1950. It came out of 120 or 30 years of very engaged argument by the finest minds we've produced in the modern period. That idea was trying to give room to whether it was a southern imagination of India, whether it was a tribal imagination of India, whether it was an imagination from any part or language group, and to say these could coexist and live together and not privilege one over the other. That in a sense there was a kind of layering and a mutuality, to use an image. It was a palimpsest. And I think that when it gets problematic is when we want to try and get down to some bedrock and say, no, it's not a palimpsest, but there's some identity which is absolutely fundamental. Because that's never the case. It's always, identity is always muddled and mixed and fragmentary, and that's what, and the astonishing thing is how rich it is for us, and why we would possibly want to reduce that to a bedrock.
Yeah, I mean, I did want to say, that's it. The mic doesn't, I think you speak sufficiently softly that the mic has to strain to hear you unless you lift it. No, just to say that I remember in the idea of India, you're making the point that you just alluded to, which is that religion didn't define India, politics did. Is that still true, though? Because increasingly, we are seeing religion as a dominant element of political discourse. Is that politics or is that religion?
Well, I would certainly say it's politics, because what we're seeing is just as in the 90s and in the 80s and 90s, politics redefined caste and created these new caste configurations that you would never find in the Manusmriti or OBCs and these pan-Indian caste agglomerations. They were created by politics and law They were not traditional caste categories. Similarly, I think politics has reconstituted religion. It's created these collectivities which otherwise in traditional religious forms would not necessarily be linked to one another. I mean, a Shaivite or a Vaishnavite in different parts of the country would follow very different rituals and practices and so forth. So what's connecting them now is the workings of politics and the mobilization of that collectivity to political ends. So I think still very much we're a project driven by politics. And I think the good thing about that is that politics is malleable. It allows change. If we think of our identities as political, they're subject to change. And I think in a democracy, precisely identities have to be changeable from one election to the other. A political party tries to persuade us to see ourselves as one thing in one election. Another party tries to see us as another identity, to give it primacy. And as long as that is going on, that's good. It's when we think we have found some ultimate identity which can't be reworked or where we can't be persuaded to see ourselves differently from how we are. That's when I think the workings of that throws sand in the workings of democracy.
Okay, we're going to open this up to the audience after one more question. So any of you who have questions, bear them in mind. Sunil, it's a silly thing to ask in some ways of an author, but if you hadn't written The Idea of India in 1997 and you were to write it today, would you do it differently? Why and in what way?
Well, I'm sure I would do it differently in many ways. I think one way in which I would do it differently is what I think I did underestimate when I wrote the book in the first edition was the sheer dynamism of the Indian economy and the way in which it really has burst into life. Whether or not to do with government policies. The sheer entrepreneurial inventiveness and dynamism, I think in the mid-90s, certainly, it had begun and there was a lot to hope for, but that's been very impressive. And I think some of the consequences of that, I think I would still describe in the same way that I did in the book, which is to say that with the dynamism, it's continued to actually exacerbate inequalities. Regional inequalities, social inequalities, gender inequalities, all of those things that were already underway have continued. So that aspect, the growth of the economy has been more than I might have expected. The other, I suppose that I would have to notice today is just, and I say this, and this is a question in a sense to you, is the disappearance of opposition, and in a democracy, it's government and opposition. And unless you have, it takes two to make democracy work. And so in a sense, where is the opposition is a question to you. But that's something that I have been struck by and worried by because, sorry?
Part of it is sitting right here, but anyway, yeah.
Yeah, well, but I think that's something, and I'm not interested in the party politics of it at all. It's just a functional, structural thing. If a democracy is to function, you need a government, you need an opposition. I mean, that's just the basic ground rules of the game. It doesn't matter who they are, and I'm not particularly interested in who they are, but I'm interested in the structure functioning. As a political scientist and as a historian, I'm interested in the basic structures that can make democracy work function, not who's filling those structures. So that's something that I would be, I would have to really take on board if I were to write the book today.
Okay. So, are there any questions in the audience? Is there somebody with a mic right there? I think if you can raise your hand, the person with the mic, there's somebody right there, if you can take a mic to him. Yep, right there in the middle of the hall. Great. If you just tell us who you are and ask your question.
Yeah. Hello, sir. I am Dr. Ahmed Raja, assistant professor. You told that there must be some opposition for a healthy democracy. But for the last two regime in 2014 and 2019, the cabinet status for opposition leader as per the protocol has not been given. So what's your opinion?
Well, as I was just saying, I mean, you know, the basic ground rules do require that an opposition be recognized. It's not a question of a governing party having the discretion to recognize an opposition. It's part of the basic ground rules of the system. So, you know, constitutionally and by the protocols and norms of government, opposition, they have to be included in certain briefings, they have to be informed of certain decisions and so on. It's not, they can't be seen as a kind of irritant or a secondary minor irritation. They're an integral part of the system of government. Otherwise, you don't have a democracy. And I think we do need to be more concerned about that. As I say, again, not about the particular political parties. They may be whatever. We all have our different preferences, and that's great, and so we should. But what we should agree on are the basic rules by which all our political parties and preferences have to play by. And those can't be subject to discretion or to the whims of power. Because when that happens, then we're on that sliding scale that we talked about earlier.
Yes, next one.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, isn't the idea of India being confused with the idea of the Indian state currently? And that's a problem, isn't it?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think there is a way, and this, you know, actually picking up on Dr. Tharuar's other point about how I would have rewritten the book. There has been a much greater expansion and growth of the Indian state over the last 20 years. And that's been quite enabling in many ways. You know, the financial inclusion, for example, has happened through, not through private initiative, but also through state infrastructure, the Aadhaar system and so on, all of which have been great benefits to citizens. But at the same time, it's made the state a lot more intrusive into the everyday lives of Indian citizens in a way that's never been the case before. The state is now in our mobile phones, the state is everywhere. And so in that sense, we have a much closer relationship to the state than ever before. Now, to take your point, when that gets linked to a definition of nationhood or a kind of ideological project, that gets into a tricky area, because there needs to be a distance between that. There needs to be a distance between the functional aspects of the state, how it does things, how it delivers things, and what policies, ideas, ideologies it projects. Because the ideas, ideologies, and so on, those at the end of the day are up to us to decide whether we want or not. The functionalities we as citizens have a right to, the state has an obligation to provide to us. When you conflate the two, as you're suggesting, when Indianness is seen as part of something that only the state possesses, that's a problem. The state is not a monopoly, doesn't have a monopoly over Indianness. Indianness belongs to everyone, and however they want to define it. I think that's one of the great messages of the Constitution. The way in which it's able to say the state doesn't define our national language, the state doesn't define our religion. And other states did. The nation states of Europe have an established church. They have a national language. We uniquely, marvelously, remarkably didn't do it. We said it's up to us to decide what we want, how we want to do these things. And that's a huge achievement, which I think we should not underestimate, and which we should really be very wary of giving up on.
But you know, those are the kinds of things that some would very much like to undo under the Hindu, Hindustan mantra. When I last met you, you were working on a book on Nehru, and I'm just curious, first of all, how that's gone, and secondly, whether Nehru, in your view, had a conception of India and how India should function that is completely fundamentally opposed to the conception prevailing today.
Yeah, I mean, I've been working on a number of different things. I mean, in between, I did a book on a history of India through 50 individual lives called Incarnations.
Yeah, I've got that.
And the work I've been doing on Nehru is sort of has grown into a kind of baggy monster. It's in a way a kind of history of 20th century India when it will get written. Through a variety of different perspectives, different lenses, through culture, through politics, through different aspects. I mean, I think, in some ways, if you look at the Nehru period now, it looks like a parenthesis. It was something that happened in between two bookends, if you like. I wouldn't draw that conclusion too hastily, though. As I said, I wrote the first edition of The Idea of India in the midst of a crisis. I think we're still in a long arc of crisis about what kind of nation we are and are becoming. Many of the transitions that were still began in the 1990s are still underway. Urban to rural, industrial, agrarian to industrial, energy transitions. All of these we're still in the throes of. So there's bound to be argument over who we are. And that's it's not innately a problematic situation. The problem is when one argument seeks to dominate all the space and says, there is only one way of being who we are. And I think, that's just not true to the rich legacy of Indian thought, politics, and action over 200 years at least.
Okay, well, I'm afraid we're out of time. I'd like to apologize to those who still had questions to ask. Thank you very much, Sunil Khilnani.
Ideas of India, yeah, Ideas of India. ABP Network's Ideas of India.